here. So welcome everybody to the Science Education Seminar. Jack and I co-chair the seminar this year. For the first half of 2019, we gathered a couple of talks around the STEAM education theme, and today we are very happy to invite Rahul Bhargava from MIT Media Lab. Rahul arranged hundreds of data literacy workshops and data therapy workshops all over the world. And when I first read his article about cultivating data literacy and data literacy education, very impressed. I think this is we need this immediately. And someone who, as you know, that work with the data analysis every day, I do a little bit data wrangling all the time. But when I see that this serious hand-down approach of data wrangling, I'm really excited to learn from Rahul and from everybody with Rahul.
Thanks. How you all doing? Good morning. Oh, thanks. So my name's Rahul, and what I wanted to do, it's such a small room of people. I have some stuff that I can talk about. I'll give you a bit of background on where I'm coming from, and then I have some topics that I think would be useful to cover in terms of framing, and then I have some activities that we can do to sort of examine and practice what I do and the way I introduce stuff. But I wanted to get a sense of who's in the room first and what you're interested in. So because it's such a small room, that can help me pick and narrow down what we can talk about for the next half hour, 45 minutes or so, and do. So this is your time to be what I like to call constructively selfish. So if there's 45 minutes that you've taken out of your day, out of your norm, to come and give yourself space to think about data literacy, how we introduce it, how we can integrate that work into your own pipelines and your own groups of people you work with, what are the particular things that you're most interested in? And I'll give you some of the sets of things that we could focus on more or less, depending on interests. So one is, if you're an educator, things that you can do that are more playful and not so technology focused, with either adults or kids or youth learners. Another thing we could talk about is if you're someone that works with data and goes from data to story in some way or some presentation, we can look at specifically at tools that are helpful along that pipeline, whether things for yourself to help you find a story or look at a set of stories to tell, or pick an appropriate technique to tell that story, or assess whether if you're trying to tell a data story to achieve some goal with an audience, how you tell and decide whether you're doing that well. So that's the second thing we can think about and talk about. A third is we could go and talk about data in society, right? Like we can talk about the role of data in society now, the ethical considerations that anyone working with data should be thinking about, and approaches for that. Within any of those, we could talk more about sort of the story, like the basic data skills of understanding what data is and how you speak data. We could talk more about finding stories, or we could talk more about telling those stories. So I've thrown out a bunch of stuff. As you simmer on that, let me ask you a couple questions just to get a sense of who's in the room. And just raise your hand, how many, and you can answer yes to multiples of these, how many of you would count yourself as an educator in some way? Okay. And how many of you would talk about yourselves as data wranglers or sort of people that work with data day to day? Okay. And how many of you would also count yourself as researchers, like that dig into it with a technical point of view? Okay, that's helpful. So you're all, this is great, this is my crowd. You count yourself as everything. That's awesome. So now that I've sort of laid that out there, tell me which of those things that I threw at you that you sort of maybe half understand what my point of view on them is. What are you more interested in and what are you less interested in?
Interested in all of them.
Because you raised your hand to everything.
So some of what I would like to find out is having either learners understand that they are manipulating data daily
and they actually are telling a story. They are not necessarily realizing that they're manipulating data to tell their story already.
Right.
That
They realize
realization
it's something they're doing already.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yes.
I think one of the things that not necessarily our group doesn't do, but in general, is so you collect data, you do something with it, and the people that need the data don't know, or need the story from the data, don't know how to access that or what to do with that information.
Yeah. So how do you bring people in to a story that you're telling to a specific set of people? Yeah, great. What are some other problems you face or things that you're interested in?
How do you teach students, like K-12 kids, how they can get into a data set and learn to tell interesting stories that are scientifically accurate based on a data set?
Great. Okay, so how do you dig in with the youth and actually connect with them in some way that isn't about like capital D data, but is about doing something they care about? Okay, that's helpful. Any other last constructively selfish comments? Yeah?
Well, I'm interested in framing these activities. I'm interested in what's on the table.
Okay, great.
So
So with that in mind, I think in my head I'm thinking about is I'll give sort of a brief intro of where I'm coming from and my angle, which touches on a couple of those things. We'll do this activity, which works with adults and youth, and will be relevant, I think, and spur some more questions. Then maybe I'll talk about the toolbox that we have available, and sort of strengths and weaknesses for working with different audiences. And then we could either, I have a bunch of those activities I could do, so we could pick one based on when people nod their head most. It's that one's most interesting. Or we could talk about how they work and what roles they fill in educational settings, like when this one is useful or when that one's useful. I'll do that stuff rather than focus on. So I'm not going to talk as much about the scaffolding for finding and telling stories as much as the activities that get at that. Okay, we'll do that. And then again, like I said, it's a small group, so if you're really interested in something, just interrupt and say so. Okay? Great. So my name is Rahul Bhargava. I'm a researcher at the Center for Civic Media over at the Media Lab at MIT, down the street. And we work on technology and social change there in a variety of ways, thinking about what role the media plays in that, and what media we use to do it. And so the Media Lab thinks about media not as TV and press, but media as the things we create with, right? What media are we working in as an artist, right? Are we wood-based, or what is that media and how we grow that media, and how do computers serve a role as a media we create with, okay? So that's one of 20-odd groups at the Media Lab. It's headed by Ethan Zuckerman, and I'm a research scientist there, which is great because I get to work with all these brilliant students, and I get to pursue my own independent research and work on all these fun projects with other folks. So my own independent research is all on data literacy and building data culture. And I come at that from a background of playful education. So my training is actually in educational robotics. That's what I did my master's in. I did it in a group called Lifelong Kindergarten. So much to the delight of my kids, I went to kindergarten twice, and they hope to do so too. And that's a group that's, worked with Lego on the Mindstorms, created Scratch. That's the educational philosophy that I was brainwashed in my youth. It's about 20 years ago. That's when that seed was planted. And in the last 10 years, so I did educational robotics for a little while. I did a bunch of museum exhibit design, which is really fun. In the last 10 years, I've been doing workshops on data literacy and data culture, helping people speak data in relevant ways with nonprofits, libraries, journalists, some companies, less of them. They have money to hire other people. I like to focus on the folks that need more help and have less resources. I ran my first workshop about 10 years ago, and it sucked. It was me and an epidemiologist, and no offense to epidemiologists in the room, but it's they don't really speak. They speak epidemiologish, and very few people speak that. And so that workshop sucked, and then I've been getting better since then, and bringing sort of this playful approach back to bear. So I think one thing I want to do So let me give you a little more background of where I'm coming from. And generally, I dig into this pipeline of going from data to story. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about is what are some of the first words that come to mind when you think of the word data? Just shout them out. Numbers. What else? Spreadsheet. Graph. Error. So this is a very analytical room. When I go into, which is what I expected, when I go into nonprofits or community organizations, I hear words like worry, fear, intimidation, expensive, right? So the room you're going into, diagnosing that room and what that word is very heavy, data. It means a lot of things. And there's all this hype and reporting, big data. It means lots of things to different people. So it's important when just in educational settings, going in and understanding what people think of it. When I go into a room of youth and do this sort of thing, when I say, well, what do you think of data? I usually hear more words that are associated with the setting, which is school. I hear science class, or a spreadsheet. I hear things about the operationalizing that's happened in school settings. I don't hear Instagram followers, right? That's not data in the rooms that I go into. So then I ask, okay, what's a story? What are the words that you think of when you think of story? What else? What are the elements of the story? Problem. Sorry? Plot.
Folklore.
Conflict, yeah.
Characters.
Inclusion, characters, yeah. There's characters that encounter some sort of problem, and there's some kind of narrative and some kind of conclusion, right? There's a story. So we get the difference between these two things. One of them is a lot more generally interesting than the other one to population at large. So we talk about the pipeline of moving between them. And you have, when you're doing data literacy work, you have to talk about Edward Tufte. He wrote these books, a wonderfully designed series of 4 books that you should have on a bookshelf somewhere here as examples. And there's a bunch to criticize there. It's very science-centric and very information-centric, not very story-centric. So my friend Mushan wrote this great piece that's about Tufte. One of his books is called Beautiful Evidence, and I think it's important to say that early because, in fact, I argue and push back, like Mushan does, that what we're actually talking about is a beautiful argument, right? So when you present data in any way, even if it's just a bar chart you've made about 5 editorial decisions already, and whether you should be conscious of them. If you're not, then you won't realize you're making an argument. But those editorial decisions are a lot closer to rhetoric in terms of academic fields and domains than science. You've decided that it's a bar chart, right, which has serious implications. You've decided the title, which things go on it, which things don't. You've decided the axes. You've decided the order of them. You've decided the categories, or maybe you didn't. The scale. You've made all these decisions. And those are all editorial decisions that are informed or should be thoughtfully made and informed by, I make charts all the time and don't think about them. But it's important to realize that even something so simple is actually far closer to story than data than we usually think. And I like having that argument because I think it's important. So that is what I take from Mushan's piece that inspires me is this idea that actually it's a beautiful argument, even if you're just arguing with yourself. And most of the time I'm arguing with myself. But if you're doing for external audiences, you're making an argument. So be conscious of the decisions you make. And we're going to talk about that more. So that's another piece about where I'm coming from. So I think it's important to talk about that framing of speaking data. And I put it in these sort of 3 buckets. It's important for me to separate these. You have the traditional, what businesses will call BI, business intelligence. You look at data to analyze some problem, make some change, reassess it, right? We've seen a lot more of the second thing here, the using data to spread the message, And this is like the infographics you all see, like using data to tell a story to get the word out about something, impact that you want, that you're making, some environmental change that's happening, so on and so forth. The third one is the one that I tend to focus on, using data to bring people together. And this is sort of the campfire idea. The idea that data is something that you can bring multiple stakeholders together around to do some fun activity that gives them ownership of the data, the story, and, and actually builds their capacity to break down some of the barriers to working with data. And that's the one that I focus on most. So I could rant more, but I think I want to talk about this. I want to talk about this last piece, and then we'll do an activity to start, and then I'll talk some more after. The last piece is that data usually gets associated with the technological tools we use to process it, right? Which in quantitative data, we've had 50 years of innovation, computer-based innovation, with tools to help us analyze it more. Qualitative data, spurts every once in a while. The tool chains suck. There's not enough innovation there. We have like a set of tools, they're really hard to learn, and that's to the detriment of data use and data storytelling because the best stories are combinations. But people forget that like those tools, like you got to pull these two things apart. The tools don't help you do things like ask good questions, find a good narrative, pick the right kind of chart even. They don't even do that, and that's easy for them to do. Hey, what kind of data do you have? Oh, it's data over time? Great. Okay, maybe you should move in this direction. Here's a set of charts you could use. How many years is it? Oh, that many? Here, maybe you should be using this chart. That's not even there. And that's a serious impediment. And so what we do in the data culture work is we pull those two apart and say, you can do your technology trainings, but there's this other set of things that you need to work on. And here's a set of activities that work on that. So let's do one of those, because otherwise I'm talking too much. So what I have is, so one of these activities is called a data sculpture. And I think I have the slide. I'll just flip forward, and then we're just going to rejigger the order here. Yeah, here. Okay. So we're going to build data sculptures. This is a fun activity that uses a simple data handout, a one-page data handout. And there's two of them. And for this activity, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to break into pairs or threes, so maybe like two groups at each table. And you have materials on your table that are craft materials. And I want you to find something interesting in this data set, this small data set that I'm giving you, teeny tiny, and build something that tells us that story. Okay? And you cannot like cut out a bar chart. Okay? Be more creative than that. If you make a line chart, out of string, you're just not trying that hard. And it doesn't have to be some revelation, but it's just something interesting that you see about what's in this data. So I have two different data handouts you can pick from. One is a little bit of data about ice cream consumption in the US, and the other is from a survey in my town, Somerville, about how people feel. It's like they called it the well-being survey, but it was called the happiness survey. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick one of these pieces of paper in your group in a minute or two, not yet, and then you're going to look at the data and see if you can find something interesting that you could build something to show us in the data. It can be one bar, it can be all the data combined, whatever. There's very little limits. But this is a think with your hands activity, which means you only get 6 minutes to do it. Okay? So very quickly, you have to find something, build something, and you can run raids on other tables if you see materials you want on that other table. There's no pens. You can only use those craft materials on the table. And just be creative and have fun with it. And then we're going to share what we made afterwards. Okay? Any questions about that? Any confusion? Okay. Go for it. I'll walk around and answer any questions, and I'll start a timer.
You can read that.
Somerville, I think it's a challenge.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Bend it like that. that's too
Which is
too primitive, right?
Think about symbols that can represent parts of your story.
I think
This
it's
one is-
end of the war and happy times to adjusting to life. Soldiers that were
Because some of those are
family stuff. I don't know. That's conjecture.
These are flavors.
Mom, dad never told me that, but.
So do we want to tell the story about the ending
There's
of
no
World War II?
resolution, right?
It's about after this thing, there's only two dimensions, right?
Split into two groups, please. Split into two groups, please.
We only,
You're one. You're one.
we're only 4 people.
You can still be friends.
Sad during the war because they don't have enough sugar. Can we draw?
No pens. No pens.
No pens, okay.
Yeah,
So
challenge.
you make somebody look sad.
And we represent
Make like little frowny faces.
I was told I was allowed to steal.
You are, yes. Great. You have 4 minutes.
Like 160 people for chocolate. Yeah.
Make sad
So we have one here.
We got 6 minutes. We got 6 minutes.
Yeah, interesting. Like, see, this is all the chocolate, right?
It's just coffee.
Yeah, and cookie and cream is kind of chocolate. No. Cookies are
Peter stuff my cookie cream.
Like one unit is double.
this one, maybe we can.
Two more minutes. You should be building something with your hands.
Uni tape.
So that's medium. This is
You're not making it
Okay, so this is
Yeah, so it's like one garland of all of this. Oh, but this is
make it bigger.
No, that's just a decoy.
Does this tell a story?
We only have 1 more minute.
This one.
What is the story?
The chocolate cake out.
I'm Pat, by the way. Nice to meet
I'm
you.
Cindy. Nice to meet you.
right there. And then we topped it with.
What do you guys need? Okay, here's double-sided tape. Here's like electrical tape. You need a happy
No, this Play-Doh works.
I snipped out the
Oh,
Much better call. Make a better call.
Okay, that's your 1 minute warning.
that's the chocolate. No, the ice cream.
Here, let's take it. Take some tape.
I think we should
Maybe I
put
should
more
have
ice
used
cream in there.
No, wait, and something.
You can see this is all one. It doesn't have a variety of flavors in here. Just like here.
Start turning out.
Okay, time's up. Pipe cleaners down. So, first of all, hopefully that was fun.
So pressure packed.
I know. High energy, high testing. There's a test at the end. Who wants to show the group what they made? Just tell us which data you used and give us the 1 minute story of what you made. Over here? Okay, great.
Yeah, okay.
You can stand up and hold it up if you want so we can see it.
Here. Okay. So what you should see is a sad ice cream and in a small cone and a happy ice cream in a big cone.
And this is all one color, so only one flavor. And this is multiple colors and beads for sprinkles.
So mostly we were interested in what was happening with this spike. And we thought maybe it had to do with sugar rationing during World War II.
So talk us through what is that symbol showing? What's happy and sad?
Oh, we have to turn this one. He's sad. So prior to the war, during the war, when sugar was being rationed, maybe you didn't have the opportunity to have treats like ice cream. So this is a small blue sad ice cream cone with one flavor and an unhappy face on it. And then once the war was over and we weren't rationing sugar anymore, maybe there was the option for more treats and a bigger variety of flavors and a bigger ice cream cone and happier ice cream and treats and sprinkles on top of it.
Let's start. So if we take a step back, we see an example of, quickly in 6 minutes, they found what I call a factoid story, right? One data point that stuck out. And then they tried to create a physical that showed us that with the symbol of the cone, right? So one symbol that's obvious in this data set to use. They had a before and after story, something we can all relate to. The before used not only size, but also color. To say blue and sadness, and has less ice cream in it, it's only one flavor. And the after has this richness of colors, it's bigger, higher, so they're encoding that data onto both color and position and scale and diversity of color. So, and using the cultural meaning in our culture of blue. So there's a lot there in that 6 minute adventure. And that's just one type of story. So anyone else want to show us what they made? Maybe somebody that used a happiness statement? Over here.
So this sad story we have is just everybody wants to hang around chocolate. The chocolate itself is the most popular, and some other popular choices are all related to chocolate. So it has its own gang group. But there are like some sad, isolated groups, like coffee and vanilla, strawberry, they just
Right.
and people just don't pay attention to them.
Nice. Excellent. So what we have here is we've done a comparison story, right? Comparing two categories, but you've rebinned the data, right? You've combined the sort of underperforming ice cream flavors and the overperforming to create sort of happy flavors and unhappy flavors, and separated them physically on that chart. So I see a comparison story there of two different categories of flavors. Other groups? Share.
It's the Somerville.
Oh, of course you.
Did we do the Somerville one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so we made the Somerville Charge. So we generally thought that more people were generally happy in Somerville,
Okay.
and so we made the happy person bigger and more colorful, and the sad person sort of sad looking and frown. And then we thought that if you were going to graph like how many people were happy, there's a bigger happy person on the higher side of the graph. And then if we could also look at it over time, as time marches on, the number of happy people is going to go up because people think we're generally moving in one direction.
Interesting. Nice. Okay. So a couple people, hold up for just a minute. So we have a symbol chosen, right? Like the pom-poms naturally suggest ice cream scoops. Here we have faces being used to represent happiness. Not crazy, kind of makes sense. And unhappiness. You have, again, a rebidden, a comparison story between there's more people saying they're happy and less people saying they're unhappy. But you have a combination and sort of a predictive model being developed saying that because people think we're moving in the right direction, that would create a situation in the future where more people will be happy. And that being represented in the spatial and sort of trying to say that these might be connected to each other. Right? So you also have sort of a causal relationship being implied. Again, in a 6-minute thing with graphs. Okay? So, that's awesome. That's exactly what sort of this activity produces. Take off your participant hat for a minute and put on your educator hat and think about what we just did, right? So we use kind of fun data that anyone can relate to. You know, it's like happiness, ice cream. These are things people get excited about. I have another one about dog populations in New York. The dog people go crazy for that. So it's meaningful but not as impactful, right? That's okay. That's okay. You need a certain level of literacy to read the handout, right? In the U.S., you're pretty good with that level of literacy, I'd argue, in like 4th, 5th grade and beyond, right? My daughter's in 3rd grade and she can read those graphs. I mean, she's brilliant, obviously. But other 3rd graders can also, like, they're doing graphing stuff in 3rd grade. So if a 4th, 5th grade, they can probably read that. Data that people can connect to, right? Like ice cream, dogs, like people connect to these things. They're real things in life. And I get that, like, so is, you know, like sea level rise. But sometimes it's better to like intro with something playful and fun. It lends itself to this. Materials for building that you already feel comfortable with, right? Even you all felt comfortable with glue sticks, even if perhaps surprised, glue sticks, pom-poms. They were here already. You knew what was coming. You feel comfortable building with them. Sit down on a computer in Excel, you may not feel comfortable with that, right? So materials you felt comfortable with so that you could focus on the story finding. A very small amount of time to force you to just decide something. And a restriction to use small groups so there's not too many cooks in the kitchen. I get in group dynamics often there's like 3 people, one will be the loudest, but you know, in a 5-minute activity, it's okay. I often make a person, like I often pick the person that has to present it to try to recorrect like, you know, the normal gender or like other imbalances that are happening in a room or power dynamics. I'll often say, oh, could you explain that to me, you know, if I see something happening. But that's some of the design philosophy behind such a simple activity, right? That's engineered and iterated on to try to create a situation where now, in the surveying that I do, what you see is that people walk away from this activity feeling like they can go from data to story in a way that they didn't feel before, right? If you say, oh, can you visualize data? People are like, oh, no. I mean, that takes a lot of work if I got to learn to do that. You do this activity, and they're like, oh, I guess I could use my information to tell a story about something. And that's the same thing. But people walk away feeling more confident. So this activity is designed to increase the confidence and awareness of going from data to story. And you just did it in 6 minutes. So I know you can do it again, right? If you sit down on a computer, you just did it. You can do it again. Just a computer, whatever. It's just a different tool. So comments about that from an educator or sort of a researcher perspective. Yeah, please.
So we got the data that had already been manipulated and transformed in some fashion.
Yeah.
As opposed to like a bunch of, a list of numbers that someone would have written down across these years.
Yeah.
Plus there were design choices to like deliberately hide a lot of the numbers in the ice cream data.
Totally. Very intentionally. Yes. Is there a question or observation?
I mean, a lot of that was a thought, but like when the person is then approaching their own data, someone hasn't cleaned it for them, and I wonder if that might suddenly introduce a lot of like stress that they didn't perceive.
Yes. So what you're pointing out is an astute observation that each activity that my colleague Catherine Gymnasi and I have come up with these, and each activity is sort of designed, like laser focused on one specific part of the pipeline. So if you look at, where's my slide? Sorry. Here. So this is my mapping of the process of working with data, and other people do circles, triangles, hexagons. There's lots of different processes. They all kind of include similar steps. So for us, each of our activities is sort of very focused on one of these steps. So data sculptures is very focused on like this intersection right here, right? It does not address the things that you said very intentionally. We have other activities that do that, and we're constantly iterating, co-designing with communities, and adding more activities that try to do that. So, so it very intentionally doesn't do that. And some of them are hard to make playful and fun, like cleaning data we struggled with, but we have this paper spreadsheet one where where Catherine came up with this about 6 months ago or so, and I've now run it a couple of times, where you put a big spreadsheet on the wall, and this is from I ran it at the UN Data Forum the first time I was there this year. So these are all like international development workers or governmental statistics bureau office people, and they walked in and they were like, oh my God, yes, because they didn't have to sit down for like a 5-person panel again. So each column, these are 3 different copies of the same spreadsheet on the wall. Each column, it has 5 different columns with different data types. And then you just fill it in on the way in, and then you have a conversation about it. And something so funny happened in this one. There was, you can see it actually in this picture. The final column says comfort with data, right? Deliberately ambiguous. Some people filled it in with like a Likert scale automatically. Some people said like, oh, a ton. Some people like drew pictures. This woman, I love that you can see this in the picture. She got up she had filled it in already. She had sat down and was watching it. She got up, walked over, and at the top there in the column, she annotated herself. She said 1 to 5. Right? So she added, it so offended her that it wasn't properly set up that she got up and added that 1 to 5 to try to give us a way to normalize that data so it wasn't qualitative data that was hard to quantify. Yes?
How do you address the issue of objectivity of data and of stories?
Yeah, so that's a long conversation. First approach is that if you take a step back, numbers have power in our culture in a way that other things don't. Writing something as a number gives it a sense of truth and authority. And we're really bad at picking that apart and questioning it. So Catherine and I argue for things called data biographies. So, you get a data set, often you'll get metadata about it that tells you how to read it. You don't get a biography of the data that says it was collected by this group during these dates, and it was demographic population data, but it doesn't have any homelessness people in it, and we created it for these intentions. That's a big problem, because people get a list of numbers and they think it's subjective in some way. Whereas it has a set of assumptions baked into it, which doesn't mean you can't use it. It's just you should know what those assumptions are. So when you're then using it, you want to acknowledge those assumptions in the story you're telling. And again, you're right, storytelling is a subjective editorial exercise, and that's okay, is what I say. Please.
I thought the problem was exactly the opposite.
Please.
It's fake news, and there's no objectivity. climate change is not real. I mean, these are the problems.
Yes.
It's not that
Yes.
people
So-
believe in objectivity, but they don't. They think people can make stuff up.
So the power that's being exploited is the power of trust and social construction of truth, right? Like this is that's the underlying problem that you're addressing. And when people raise this, I say, well, look, they say, oh, there's a crisis in data. Like people don't trust anything. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like people never trusted anything. Like you thought that number was truth, but you didn't address the context it was in and how that group thought you were full of shit. And like, so we are in a situation where the challenges are even bigger. But like in climate change, we've been there for like 20 years, right? The best thing we've learned from climate change communication is how bad we are at communicating with science, right? Like and we've had great psychology studies that show us, this is before all the stuff in sort of before Fox News, right? That show us that if you try to go to someone whose belief is very tied to their self-definition, and challenge that belief, then they re-entrench themselves in their self-definition. And what in this country groups have done is very effectively tied certain beliefs to self-definitions, right? So abortion is part of being a Christian. So if you're a Christian, like you have to believe a certain way about abortion, so you can't challenge someone on that. Climate change is part of like the climate change denial is part of being someone that supports a sort of strong economy and American exceptionalism. So you can't challenge, that's part of your self-definition. So you can't challenge someone on climate change. So these things have existed long before sort of the word fake news, which is a terrible word. Pull it apart. We're talking about traditional propaganda, right, which is like opinionated telling of what's happening in the world. Disinformatia, which is channel pollution, right? This information channel is full of crap, I can't trust anything. And stuff that's actually made up. It turns out, and we wrote, like literally my colleagues just finished a book on the 2016 election. So we do media manipulation work. That is what pays my salary, right, is actual manipulation. We have this big project called Media Cloud, so I could go on for a long time. I'd love to dig into it. But like the third one, which is what people generally get worried about, stuff that's made up by a Macedonian teenager, tiny sliver of what's actually happening when you do the studies. So what you have is people deliberately polluting a channel to reduce trust and people doing traditional propaganda work. So how do you work on those two problems? Traditional propaganda work, there's a long history of responding to that. That's not a new problem. Channel pollution, also a long history. Not in the US, but in Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we have muscles to work on these and people are trying to learn from them. But when it specifically comes to data, information, storytelling with data is just that. It's storytelling. So how do you build trust? Right? If you go in there saying, I'm the US government, that's going to work in some communities. It's going to have the opposite effect in other communities. If you say, I'm the police working on the police data initiative out of the White House, that's going to help you in some communities. It's going to hurt you in other communities. So that's, again, like an old problem. So I don't believe these are new problems. I believe we don't have answers, but I believe we have a lot of pointers.
If you go back to your graph there and step it down, or that timeline of breaking down the problem, some of this is like loaded words, like you were talking about another aspect. When you say cleaning, a cynic could say manipulation. So understanding how you manipulate data or clean data or how you massage data to tell your story, there's that learning aspect, that gray area where you are trying to tell a story that has a foundation or doesn't.
Right,
It's apparent.
And there's some simple rules when you're in that gray space, right? Like if you are trying to tell a story with data and other data you have directly contradicts it, you're not in the gray area, you're in the red zone, right? So there's some clear lines that in my teaching I can use. But it's important to say it's a gray area because storytelling with data is about like crafting your narrative and like and interpretation of data. And you might get some things analytically wrong, right? Which is like it's going to happen to everyone. It happens to me. You're going to leave out something or forget to normalize for something. And you're going to construct a story. And part of constructing the story, when I teach it, is about thinking about all the responses to that story and trying it out with those groups. And then trying to figure out what your response is to that response and then bake that into the story.
And that's your classmate or your peer review.
Right. Exactly.
It's the same.
Exactly.
It's the same check
Right.
to your story.
Right. So I don't think we should avoid using data. I don't think that, I'm not the kind of person like, everything's subjective, you can't do anything. That's not useful. Like, okay, everything's subjective. We need to make smart decisions about the world and how we use data and tell stories. That's how I finish that sentence. If someone says like, but everything is subjective. I don't know, it wasn't precisely what you were getting at, but it's some of my thoughts about those issues that are the reality of the world we live in. And I also believe that the reason I focus on this work is trying to build literacy, right? It's a traditional response to situations where I think there's a problem in society needs to be thought about. Like, this is the role of science museums, right? In communication, it's building literacy. This is the role of activities in educational settings, is to build literacy so you can then be a critical consumer of data. In fact, we have activities that we call warm-ups that are about building your ability to use language. We call it a deconstructed data viz, where you look at a visualization, an infographic, and you pull it apart. Try to figure out the data they're using, the visual techniques they used, and the story they're telling, and whether it's good, it's told well or not. And that specifically works on those skills, those muscles. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. I'm supposed to go until like another 5 minutes, or should I stop? No, we have plenty to do, but 10 minutes. Oh, okay. So I think I could do a couple things. One is we could do another activity, or I could sort of talk through some of the activities we have available if you sort of are more like, educators, we want stuff to use. Or we could talk some more about this pipeline and sort of how and where I approach hands-on approaches to it. Any opinions?
Are these, the activities that you use like these, are those available?
Yeah, so sorry, great point. Thank you. Yes, so all of this stuff is documented. I don't know, I didn't try to get on the web here, but you have these stickers on your tables, Data Culture Project and Data Basic. So datacultureproject.org, all of these activities are there. Every single one of them has a write-up about how to run it yourself with materials list. Some of them have video facilitations where it's the sort of thing where you can show a video to a group and then run the activity, show another video, run a share back, and then show a third video to try to bridge to their real work situation or their real life situation. Yes, it's exactly that. And educators. So some of them... So government uses stuff, but not as much as, nonprofits have been our primary audience and newsrooms. But then, like I said, libraries, governments, and I also talk at large corporate events and stuff. But I do less of that. And so they're all documented on there and how to run them. Some of them use websites that are mobile friendly or on desktop computers to do the activity. Maybe 50% is in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Excuse me, including for the online ones, culturally localized data. So like in the Portuguese thing where we analyze text, it has lyrics from MBP music, not American music. And they're all, the websites are all screen reader accessible. So that stuff's really important to us in terms of privileging audiences that are usually left behind in these other main tools that are being built for data analysis. And we're looking for larger fund. Like I'm getting in front of funding agencies right now, trying to get larger funding to do more translation, more documentation, more activity design. But you all know about that. so I'm just that pipeline, developing that pipeline now. And so far it's been supported by, again, by the Media Lab, by Knight Foundation, and by PAX over at Stanford, the Philanthropy and Civil Society, because they focus on nonprofit education. So they particularly are interested in that. So yes, all free, all online. Other questions?
Well, I think, since no one's really voicing, it'd be great to see an activity that deals with interpretation or what's good data, what's bad data, what's an error. Do you have something?
Okay.
Off the top of your head,
on data, yeah, or
in 5 minutes or less.
Yeah. On data or story? Like what's a good story or what's good data? Data. Okay.
Because we can always make the story about ourselves.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Okay. So let me think for a second. which one's best for that.
In a science class, when kids do an experiment, and you're not doing subjective things like how I feel or what taste I like, when they, how far did the marble go down the ramp, and they get their data from the experiment, and they work, and they have like 5 groups in the class, and at the end, the kids take their data and they put it on the smart board. And they want to spend all the time drawing a fancy colored thing on the smart board. They get the data up there. And then the kids in the class look at the data. And they develop skepticism where they see, well, that one's 5, that one's 6, that one's 4, that one's 8. What's with that 8 one? And the kids can develop, they can look at the data and say, wait, that's out of line. Even in the 4th grade, they love to do that. And instead of thinking that the group that did the 8, they made a mistake, they can realize if you can identify the mistake, it's not a mistake. But to develop the skepticism, to look at the data and find mistakes in it, even at an early age, is, I think, really important to do. And it's real data, real data that they develop themselves. You can get that in science class.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that one sec. So the activity I would run is just my spreadsheet version of that, but I already gave away the ending, so I don't want to run the activity. It would be this one. It would be the fill in a paper spreadsheet. So let me. Yeah, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Let's get this comment and response, and then I'll tell you a bit more about this activity. I kind of I think doing it now wouldn't have the weight that I want because I kind of gave it away. Yes.
So, that kind of skepticism, I think, gets at what we mean by bad data, because a lot of the times, I see if some study or report comes out that says something that is disagreed with, then the answer is to pollute the data source, that there aren't enough people in it, there's some, whatever flaw in the methodology, then the entire thing gets thrown away because it's corrupted. And that is enough to deal with it. And there will always be something, right? You can have more people, sure. You can always have more people. And it's not like anyone actually has power analysis to know how many people you need. They just say it only has 300, you need at least 300 million people to study. And so that's they aren't actually identifying what bad data is, but they have half of the training to know what words would identify bad data. And so I think this sort of gets at how do you train them to be able to recognize where on that continuum between good and bad. Is the 8 just a mistake, but if someone got 600, that's clearly wrong.
But it also, you want to have them have a critical analysis of why it's good, not always beat down the outlier. Because sometimes there's importance in an outlier.
Right.
And not always beat down, you're wrong because you're off the curve. And it's that group mentality. Everybody's right except for you.
So
you don't want to go there.
There's different levels of critical awareness, right? So when I think about good or bad data, the reason we do this activity, because it gets at a couple different things. One, it gets a sample size, right? Because we look at age, and then I can say, at this conference, what's the median age? And people will be like, this data set is 33. And then someone else says, but that's self-selected in this group. That's not a good sample at all. And we're like, okay, we get a sample size right away, right? Second, we get at dirty data from a very technical point of view. Some people will write their birth month and year in text, like January 2nd. Some people will say 1/4. Some people will write the month first, 11/3. So we get at that very. Some people will leave something empty, and then we talk about these are all sort of typically when clean data is used, it means a set of rules about sort of normalized entry type and missing data values, understanding what a null means, having it be encoded in the same way, things like that. Then we get survey design because they're like, your header was stupid. That was very unclear. Kind of the point. Thank you. So then we get the survey design piece, and so then we get how the questions are asked, who gets to pick the questions that are asked. So we get a power dynamics and data collection. We also get to, so the columns up here are first name, hometown, shirt color. So we get to gender dynamics in terms of like, well, I'm not wearing a shirt, I'm wearing a dress. So you just left me out of your data. We get to, there's a day and month of birth, there's how many devices you carry, and comfort level with data. So it seems pretty innocuous, right? But I have first name, hometown, and birth month and day, right? That gets me pretty damn close to social engineering into your bank account.
Right. Like, yeah, here's my
Right?
PIN number too, but
Yeah, like pretty damn close. And then everyone in the room was like, oh, I didn't think of that.
yeah.
And then we get to questions around data and security. And I say, oh, well, I'm going to rip this up afterwards. And I take pictures like this where you can't actually read it, even if you zoom in. So you don't need to worry, I'm not going to use your bank account. But seemingly innocuous data, of course, is sensitive, especially when it's combined with other data points out there. And this is how people learn everything about you, by combining disparate data sets. And the error rates are high, but not high enough that doesn't make it useful. So they make bajillions of dollars doing this, the data brokers. So we get at that, too. And what was the other one? Oh, and then it's bridges to asking questions, right? So we'd say, oh, with this data, are there any interesting questions you can ask? And that's a different activity. So that's the reason this activity is the best one for talking about data types, data collection, survey design. And this is just the same thing as the science trick that this gentleman mentioned, right? When you collect the data yourself, you create something yourself, and you exercise the exact same muscle. It just is a different apparatus, experimental protocol for getting at that same learning goal.
I'm just curious, when you do this is clearly a picture of adults, and so when you do it with younger people, do they ask different questions?
I have not done this with youth yet. I should ask Kathy if she has. Like I said, she came up with this about 6 months ago, so she's run it a few times. I've just run it 2 or 3 times.
It seems like a great idea.
With adults. Yeah, and it's just a simple thing. None of these are like a super insightful, brilliant thing. I'm not saying it. It's just like, we forget to use these muscles when we start talking about data because it has this sort of tool-centric, technology-centric thing. So I get into a lot of rooms to argue, let's remember those muscles. And again, some of these are supported by websites and some of them are just low-tech.
So back to your point of, when you have kids in K-12 who are, in science class and there's a prescriptive lab to do and there's prescriptive data that you should see kind of thing. But then kids get weird data. And I had a professor in undergrad who said to us, there's no such thing as bad data, it's just data. You need to know what to do with it. And so I think that's what kids don't often know or don't know how to look at what they have and be able to figure out what to do with that and look at it and go, wow, that does not fit here, or that doesn't seem like anything that anybody else is getting. What do we have here? And do we need to do something different? Do we need to retest this? But it's like, okay, here's the data that I have, and I need to evaluate it, but I need to know how to evaluate it. And I don't know that kids always have that sense. They think that, or a lot of times it's, well, I was supposed to get this, but not, here's what I have.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's good or bad, it doesn't look like that. And yes, I understand that there is, bad data, but at the same time, it's, here's what I got. What does that mean and what do I do with that?
There's a lot of teachers using our activities around the world. There's like networks of schools that have baked it in. There's schools here that are using it. They don't like the one that we call WTF CSV, because what the fudge CSV. They don't like that one, but the other ones they're down with. And one of the reasons they do that is that, just to bridging back to when we started, we fit square into STEAM, right? Like we have a very good STEAM story because we are getting at the data analysis pieces using some of the arts invitations. So there are people that are like doing data presentation by painting mosaics, tiles as part of a story of the school based on data they've collected about the school. There were people that are using our storytelling tool belts and doing data presentations in a large auditorium by doing stand-up sit-downs. There were kids in, I think it was in northern Thailand that made this great thing around backpack weight, where they found the average weight and then like filled the backpack with rocks and then had that as the presentation that they did. So there are people that are integrating data sculptures into presentations of basically like query-driven investigation. So where the groups of students are picking data they want to dig into. So like there was a high school student, and this is in Cambridge, who picked data about breast cancer incidence, which is very high in her family, and wanted to look at the differences between in African American populations, where incidence is far higher to other populations in the US, and did this whole investigation and presented it on this amazing data sculpture that was like 2 breasts, but one was like after a mastectomy, and one was above, and all the data was presented as that. It's very powerful. And she had picked the topic herself, made this investigation, done the investigation, and then presented it that way. So there's lots of modes, and like MIT Museum does this, where they have kids come in, poke around on topics they're interested in, looking for data, and then making data sculptures based on that, what they find. So we do a lot of K-12 stuff, and there's a lot of teachers that have found our stuff and baked it in, and we have not done the connection to the curricular goals in any state, but some teachers have.
So one question, and I'm going to leave this necessarily wrong. How do you treat uncertainty?
So most fields are really bad at presenting uncertainty in data. Really bad. Like confidence bars, like really, you know. Some of the best examples I have are things like you know that app Dark Sky that has a squiggly line? Like it's an animated area chart to show uncertainty, right? So it goes up and down to show probability of rain coming. So you get that it's uncertain, it keeps on changing. And it's most of the data sets and settings that I'm working with are not ones where uncertainty is a big deal, so I haven't had to wrestle it with these activities. I haven't come up with a good activity that gets at it yet, but it's on my list. Because it keeps coming up, and like I've been on work groups where like our goal is to try to catalog the ways that visualizers try to convey uncertainty to their readers in novel ways that aren't just like gray outlines or
green is good and red is bad.
Yeah, right. So I don't have a great answer for you besides like empathetically agreeing that it's a struggle and the struggle is real, and to say that it hasn't moved up my priority list yet. But I would love to brainstorm activities that get at that and how to communicate it. I think that would be super valuable, but I haven't made the time yet. Okay, pizza's here, which means I'm standing between you and pizza. So I'm going to shut up. Any last question or thoughts? So like I said, all that stuff's available on datacultureproject.org. And that links to a bunch of other stuff. My email is rahulb@media.mit.edu. Feel free to contact me if you try stuff out. I'd love to hear it. Hopefully this was fun and connected in some ways to the work that you do and the settings that you do it. And I'm going to hang out and have a little bit of food too.
I'm just going to ask one last question.
Please. Now you're standing between them.
Yeah, I am. Oh, maybe I can ask it around. It was just, have you done any research or evaluation into the impact of these?
Yeah, so sorry, I didn't mention any of that, like academic stuff. Like, there's like a whole bunch of papers that are about specific activities or design methodology. We tend to write in either like, written in informatics journals, in education journals, in digital humanities, also in like CHI, like tool design. So all of those are linked on the site, like a paper section and publication section. There's some quick examples are, we did a data mural in Brazil. So one of my big efforts is doing data murals with communities where we bring people together around some key data to look at an issue. We facilitate by mixing and matching these activities, identifying a story they want to tell and a motivation for telling it. Then we start with that story and collaboratively design a visual to tell that story. And then we paint it in a mural. Sometimes it looks like an infographic, sometimes it just looks like a mural. And so we did one in Brazil at the invitation of the government of Minas Gerais, and we went back a year later. and looked at the outcomes and documented really like a nascent data culture happening where like those activities and those muscles were being brought into other curricular verticals that were not connected when we were there. There's one about where I argue that data sculpture is uniquely suited in youth settings to introduce kids to working with data because of their familiarity with the materials and their approach to creativity. And I document projects like this amazing girl, it was like a 12-year-old who started knitting a scarf that was, that's documenting the air quality and like used scratchier fabric and different color. And I was like, this is the stuff you see on like the flowing data blog, like you see on these blogs and stuff. This is like a 12-year-old girl. They get it. They're better at it than us because they don't have to unlearn all the crap that we learned, right? They don't have to unlearn that. I don't need to give them permission to play, right? With the ways they do stuff. They own that. So then there's stuff about how we created the tools. There's stuff about like the short-term impacts. So there's a bunch of papers.
Great.
We keep doing that occasionally. It's not one of the primary outputs, but I am a research scientist where I have to do it occasionally. Luckily, I don't get measured on that. I'm not a professional director right there. So. Okay.
Great. Thank you.